Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to share some words of Torah with you on this Rosh Chodesh Elul, Erev Shabbos, Parashat Shoftim. We find ourselves this afternoon between the DNC and the RNC, and in the midst of weeks filled with heated political discourse in our country. How appropriate that this Shabbat we read what is known as Parshas HaMelech in the second aliyah of this week's Parsha, describing the parameters of Jewish government and the appointment of a king. Based on this passage in our Parsha, especially the contradiction of V'amarta sim alai melech, which implies that appointing a king is nothing more than a desire of the people, and the next pasuk, som tasim alecha melech, which implies that it's a mitzvah from Hashem, so many questions have been raised by Chazal and later Jewish thinkers about what the ideal form of Jewish government might be, and specifically whether the appointment of a king is an obligation or an allowance. This discussion is further complicated by the passage in Sefer Shmuel in Parashat, in which Shmuel Hanavi criticizes the people's desire to appoint a king. There are some truly fascinating articles addressing a whole host of theoretical and now, in the modern state of Israel, actually practical questions surrounding this topic of Jewish government. More on that perhaps another time. For today, one of the details about a Jewish king that's revealed to us in our Parsha is that aside from the restrictions placed upon him to guard his moral stature, such as not having too much wealth and too many horses, the king also has an obligation, according to the Torah, to write a Sefer Torah. The pasuk says, "Vayak yeshivto al kisei mamlachto," when he becomes the king, when he sits on his throne, "V'kasav lo es Mishnah HaTorah azos," he should write down this Mishnah Torah. Not only should he write it down, it should be with him, and he should read it all the days of his life, so that he should learn to fear God, to keep all the mitzvahs of the Torah, and maintain his stature as a role model in Torah and mitzvahs to the rest of the nation. Rashi explains that from the words Mishnah HaTorah Hazos, we learn that the king must actually write 2 Sifrei Torah in his lifetime. As Rashi says, "Acha shimunachas bebeis genazav, va'acha shenichneses v'yotzes imo." A king has to write one Torah that is placed in his storehouse, and another Torah that travels with him on all of his comings and goings. Some explain the need for the Torah in storage actually arises from the fact that the other Torah will be going and coming with him into all circumstances of life, and it's more likely that that Torah could become damaged. And so you would need a kind of Torah of record in storage to use in order to fix the damaged Sefer Torah or to write a new Sefer Torah and make sure that all the laws are kept as accurately as possible. Chazal further elaborate on the Torah that comes and goes and mentions one specific example of what that might look like: war. When the king goes out to war, he takes the Torah with him, and when he comes home from war, he brings it back. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says, "Yotzei lemilchama motziya ima." When the king goes out to war, he has to take that Torah with him. Nichnas, when he comes back from war, hu machniso imo. He takes the Torah back inside to his throne, to his palace, to his home with him. Shenemar v'haisa imo v'kara bal kol yemei chayav. As the pasuk says, the Torah has to be with him all the days of his life, in all circumstances of life, including the circumstance of war and the circumstance of home. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Ginsburg was a fantastic rabbi, came from Europe and served in Denver, Colorado at the turn of the 20th century. In his Sefer Yalkut Yehuda, which I love to quote, he has a Drasha on this Gemara in Sanhedrin in which he explains the symbolic need of Chazal to focus on the example of war and on the contrast of war and home. He says that it conveys a lesson not just for kings but to every one of us. He says, "Kshehu yotzei lemilchama, Bal Yachshov, Kevan Sheholech Lishpoch Dam Anashim, Im Ken Hutra Lo Haritzua, Ve'afshar Lo Lasos Kol Davar Aser." A king shouldn't think that just because he goes out to war and he's engaged in all kinds of different exigent practices, including sometimes spilling the blood of other human beings, that all of a sudden all the chains are gone, all the cords are loosened and untied, and he can do now whatever he wants. Every Isser, every prohibition in the Torah is now relieved for him and allowed for him. L'kach ba'inan she'is sefer Torah imo lahodio lo shegam ata tzarichu lishtado b'kiyuma v'lo hutra lo ki im b'dvarim ha'achrechim l'kiyuma am, is to carry the sefer Torah to war in order to remind himself that not all is lost. that not all the restrictions of the Torah are lifted just because you're in an exigent circumstance in life, but that the Torah requires careful attention and scrutiny even on the battlefields, the real battlefields or the battlefields of life. Ve'od, sheval yachshov sherak be'es hamilchama, she'az hu b'sakana, az min ha'ra'oi lios medakdik b'mitzvos, aval lo b'shah shalom, lachen amru, shegam kshu nichnas b'beiso yoshev b'shalva, tzarich lios medakdik b'mitzvos u'b'limat Torah. But the Torah also says he has to bring it back home, so that he shouldn't think that now that he's in a peaceful time, maybe he can relax his observance of the Torah. Maybe the scrutiny and careful observance of mitzvahs is only necessary in the exigent circumstances of life, in the war, in the battlefield. But now that he's home and relaxed, he can be a little bit more relaxed in Torah as well. Rabbi Ginsburg is suggesting here that Hashem's mandate of the king's Torah going out and coming in with him to all the settings of life is meant to address two opposite but natural human tendencies. People are sometimes tempted to lower standards or bend rules when facing unusual events in life. The Torah therefore requires the king to bring the Sefer Torah with him when he goes out to war, reminding him and all of us that the Torah remains relevant and authoritative even in times of difficulty or adversity. On the flip side, there's another human tendency among human beings as well. The tendency to turn to God specifically when one feels threatened and in desperate need of assistance. In times of stability, people might feel overly secure and neglect or become lax in their religious responsibilities. For them, maybe true religious commitment and connection to Hashem emerges in periods of duress, when they feel helpless or vulnerable. As they say, there's no atheist in the foxhole. I think it's a very true statement in many ways. Therefore, Hashem also requires the king to bring the Sefer Torah back with him when he returns from war, when the crisis is over, when the normal routine of life is restored, in order to convey to him the importance and to convey to us the importance of maintaining our commitments to Torah even in the tranquil times. The king's travel with his Torah and all his comings and goings is meant to remind us that the Torah must govern our lives through both thick and thin. In times of crisis and in times of tranquility, it must accompany us in all circumstances and situations. When COVID first began, we were thrust into a panic, not knowing exactly where to go or what to do or how to behave. As the months have gone on, we still feel stressed and uneasy about the changes to life and the uncertainties that abound, but have found some kind of abnormal new normal, and I know that all of you know exactly what I mean by that. It would be easy under these circumstances to feel overwhelmed and to say that life is already so hard and so turbulent that we need to relax our responsibilities to Torah, make life a little bit simpler. It would be easy under these conditions to fall into a pattern of laxity in observance of Torah and mitzvahs, for many reasons. Firstly, life is genuinely tough and overwhelming, and we're always looking for ways to cope. Secondly, during these times of COVID, we don't have the same kind of positive peer pressure or social encouragement that usually surrounds us in our wonderful shul and community and pushes us to be our best selves in religious life. No one's watching us, since we're all in our homes. No one is keeping us accountable. Lastly, over the last few months, there have been real halachic leniencies invoked by our rabbis and poskim because of the danger to human life or shasat chak, exigent circumstances, which have kind of changed the dynamic of observance a little bit. For the first time in Jewish history, every shul on the planet, almost, pretty much, shut down for weeks. No minyanim for weeks, sometimes months. It's not far-fetched to imagine that many of us could simply take that kind of legitimate conduct one step further and become a little bit negligent in other areas of halacha that are not dangerous or exigent. For example, people were legitimately, for health reasons, not coming to shul for minyan at all for weeks on end, or are now currently still not coming to minyan for health reasons. And so it would be conceivable for a person to consciously or subconsciously feed off of that reality and become looser or sloppy in tefillah b'tzibur or in tefillah in general. It'd be easy to say, I daven at home for so many weeks, I'll just continue to do that, even though the risks might now be low enough for me to attend. Or a person might say, it's so cumbersome to sign up for minyan and sheets and cancellations, I'll just daven at home. Or a person might say, there's so many minyans now in town and at shul, and in all different locations on Shabbos, no one will even notice if I'm there or not, so I might as well just stay home in the comforts of my living room and the comforts of my bedroom. Or a person might say, there's just so much going on at home right now in my house. And there's so many distractions that my tefillah at home has so little kavanah, it probably isn't worth much anyways. So I just give it up for a little while and come back to it when all of this is over, and so on and so forth. We can rationalize so many things. And it's not shameful or awful or unspeakable. It's just normal. It's the normal reality of being human. Well-meaning, sincere, believing individuals can develop these tendencies almost without even knowing it. Whether you think this applies to you or not, it's important for us to at least be aware of this natural human tendency to become more laid back than we should in religious life in tough times, and to try to address it. As we begin this month of Elul, this month of introspection, this month of self-improvement, this month of building a closeness with Hashem, of preparing for the Yamim Noraim, we must listen carefully to the words of our Parsha, to the Torah's description of the King's Sefer Torah coming and going with him into all circumstances of life, in order for us to be reminded that even in times of adversity, like our own, even when things seem to be falling apart around us, we have the capacity and the obligation to push ourselves, to keep our commitments to Torah. We need to try even harder to remain steadfast in our observance and in our learning, which in many ways can become less of a burden and a challenge, and more of our saving anchor and lifeline in these chaotic times. This month of Elul, we have to take a good look within ourselves and take our spiritual temperature just as much as we take our physical temperature. If we do see some laxity creeping into our religious behavior, then even if we don't know how to fix it or how to surmount that challenge, we might at least be able to name it, to recognize it, and to be honest about it. That itself is an amazing start to our journey of tshuva, and I'm certain that if we've even taken those baby steps and start that conversation with ourselves, Hashem will wait for us with open arms and help us along the rest of the way. I wish you all a Chodesh Tov, a Shabbat Shalom, and a wonderful journey of tshuva ahead.